Hey, glad you can be with us here. This short lecture is actually going to cover using examples as well as comparisons in our writing. This is part of a class that I teach for BA5 Business Communications at the Willow International Center. My name is Matt Alanis. I'm the instructor for the course here. And over the course of the next 20 to 30 minutes or so, we're going to familiarize you with the importance of using examples as well as comparisons in your writing. We'll be covering a couple different things as well as utilizing both examples and comparisons. So we'll give you a couple of examples, kind of go over the importance of that, see what it looks like practically, and hopefully give you some of the skills that you need to do to increase the effectiveness of your writing. So let's start off with some examples here. Examples are very important. They help your reader better understand what it is that you're trying to communicate. Not only from the standpoint of effectiveness, but they're also much more clear. They're much more easy to comprehend, and then a lot of times they communicate more effectively what the information is that we're trying to convey. They also help you communicate in what's referred to as concrete terms. Being concrete is all about being specific. We don't want to communicate in these vague terms that people don't understand. We want to be very specific in our writing. And by using examples, that helps readers understand specifically what we are trying to communicate. I'll give you an example. Abstract. If you were to communicate very vague and abstract terms, maybe you would use something like professional sports team. Now, I don't know the images that come to your mind, but I have a number of different sports teams that are coming in my mind across a number of different actual sports. You know, you have football, basketball, obviously wrestling, you have baseball, hockey. You know, so I have a hard time getting a good picture in my mind what would be referring to in terms of a professional sports team. Now, if you were to be more concrete here, let's say you would use a specific sports team, like the San Francisco 49ers, for example. Obviously, if you say the San Francisco 49ers, I know quickly and very clearly what it is that you're trying to communicate. It's very concrete. So we want to try and use this style of communication in our writing, and making examples is a great way of doing that. Okay. So let's look at a few examples here. There are three types of examples that are commonly used in writing. The first are what are called brief examples. So we'll spend some time kind of unpacking what are brief examples. I'll show you some examples of what are brief examples so you have a good depiction in your mind of what that looks like. We'll also show you narrative examples, which are a little different, but once again kind of in line with a brief example. And then lastly, we'll show you what it looks like to utilize both brief as well as narrative examples. Obviously, you can utilize both. You don't have to refer to one or the other. And there is a good way to tailor what you're trying to say to include both brief and narrative examples. So let's work on brief examples here for a couple minutes. Brief examples should be utilized in the majority of your writing. Whenever you're trying to communicate information, particularly things that may be difficult for people to understand, examples provide a way to give extra meaning so that there isn't this misunderstanding of what it is that you're trying to communicate. So if I were to say something like, I work as a market research analyst, depending on your background, depending on if that's even familiar to you, a lot of things may come to mind. That's not very clear. You may have a number of different assumptions or hold a number of different meanings to what it is that a market research analyst does. So that is not very clear. That is very abstract. If you were to want to communicate in a much more clear, concise, and concrete way, you would provide an example. So what you could say is, I work as a market research analyst. I get the opportunity to develop and administer survey questionnaires for my clients. Not only that, but I also compile the data and interpret what it means for my clients. You get a better idea of what a market research analyst does, even if you're not familiar with the position. Because I added the example of the things that maybe a market research analyst actually does over the course of their day, you now have a better understanding of what the job entails. Now, that wasn't necessarily anything difficult to actually include in my writing. I just described what it is that a market research analyst does. So particularly with communicating positions communicating positions, it's always good to have some type of example, because you can't assume that people automatically know what your job entails. Right? Job titles are very misleading at times. So being able to provide an example on top of that can provide some extra meaning to your audience. All right, next we have narrative examples. Narrative examples are essentially just stories, and they're really simply a paragraph in length, not really any longer than that. Most people, when they think of stories, they think I have to ramble on and on for pages and pages. Not necessarily. They can be somewhat brief, although they're more lengthy than a brief example from what you see. But you're telling a story. You're explaining a real-life situation that you were in, and your reader is getting a better understanding of what it is you're trying to convey by reading your story. A lot of times, the actual narrative part is the most interesting part of the actual paper because we remember stories, right? People that give us real-life examples, we remember those examples, but we may not necessarily remember just facts and figures or information. So let's give you an example of how to use this narrative to enhance your writing. You can write something like, it's important for you to get good grades in school. I mean, depending upon your feeling with regards to that, you may think, yeah, maybe it is. That's kind of common knowledge. Or may think, you know what, I don't necessarily need good grades. I just need to pass, need to graduate. I get that piece of paper. That doesn't carry the same weight to it. So let's go ahead and add a narrative example that should add a little bit more value to this particular passage. And that is, I wish that when I was in school, I realized the importance of getting good grades. Growing up, my mom and dad always said that good grades are the key to landing a successful job out of college. Unfortunately, I didn't adhere to their advice. Although I didn't find grades to be particularly important, I soon realized that employers did. It took me 12 months after graduation to finally land a job. To make matters worse, most of my friends received job offers prior to graduation. So you can see that the short narrative example provides you with a little bit more emphasis, right? Not just assuming that your listeners or your readers will believe that getting good grades is important. But if you provide them with actual real-life example of how you've seen this and how you've seen it played out practically, then that provides a little bit more emphasis. It's hard to negate that good grades aren't important when you bring up a scenario, a situation, or a story much like the one we've provided here. So, like I said before, using narratives are oftentimes the most interesting parts in your writing, so it's definitely important to actually put those in there. You don't want to overuse them, though. You know, obviously you don't want there to be stories the entire time, but it is important to pepper them in there. You know, one, maybe two in your writing provides some great emphasis to highlight some things. So what does it look like to use both? Well, it's actually very easy. So once again, we have our market research analyst back, and we're trying to describe the position for what we do, and we're going to use both a brief example as well as a narrative to even further enhance the awareness and understanding of our particular audience. So first, I work as a market research analyst. Although my job includes analyzing data, I also get to conduct in-person interviews and focus groups. I enjoy these interviews because I get to interact with people instead of numbers. This passage right here, this first passage, it would be your brief narrative or brief example, so to speak, because you're giving them an example of what you do, right? You obviously analyze data, but you also do in-person interviews. You conduct focus groups. So you have a little bit more of an understanding on what this person actually does than if they were just to say what their job title is. Now, moving on, you see, in addition to in-person interviews, I also get the opportunity to present my findings to our clients. For example, I was put in charge of presenting our work to the board of directors at Sun Systems Incorporated. This required me to prepare a brief presentation with various graphs and charts to show my findings. On top of that, none of the equipment in the boardroom was working properly that day. As you can imagine, this was quite the learning experience in testing your equipment ahead of time, and I do understand there's some misspellings and different things there. These are passages I've used to kind of for people to be able to critique and things with regards to spelling. So obviously there are some misspellings and different things. But you notice the important thing that I want you to realize not necessarily is the misspelled words, but just the example itself. Okay, you notice that it's a narrative. It's telling a story. You're telling about, what you specifically did and also kind of the ins and outs of how that day particularly went. So once again, we're just reinforcing what we're trying to communicate, and that is to make sure that people have an understanding of whatever it is that we're trying to say. In this case, we want to make sure they have an understanding of our particular positions. All right, comparisons. Comparisons are very important as well. Comparisons are actually very difficult to think of, though. But although they're difficult to think of, they have they have an effective way of making our points and doing it fairly succinctly. Now you can either utilize brief or long comparisons depending upon what your interest is. Yeah, brief ones are entirely okay, so you don't have to go into a rather lengthy discussion about a comparison. It can be rather brief. So let's look at this. This is an example of a brief comparison. So a lot of what meeting planners do is behind the scenes. It is like planning a dinner party. Your guests don't see all the work and preparation you put into the dinner, and you probably don't want them to. You want them to have a great time and leave feeling good. Me too. It's my job to sweat the details, not yours. So this is once again providing a comparison between what meeting planners do and what it's like to actually plan a dinner party. And many of us are probably more familiar with what goes into planning a dinner party than we are what goes into maybe planning a meeting. Maybe you have experience in both, but it's not common to have experience in both, right? So if you're communicating information, and if you know your audience and know that chances are they probably have some experience in planning dinners, probably not meetings, the jobs are very similar, maybe I can draw a comparison between the two. It's a great way of communicating what the job entails. I may not plan meetings, but I have planned a dinner party before, so I understand what you're getting at in terms of what you're trying to communicate. Now you can also use examples and comparisons, of course, to make matters even worse. So it's important to utilize a combination of different things. Using one or the other isn't necessarily the only thing you have to do. You can utilize a multitude of different resources that are at your disposal. So I encourage you to use examples and comparisons throughout your writing to just increase the overall effectiveness of what you're trying to communicate. So let's look at a quick passage here to point out the example and the comparison here. Once again, going back to the position of the market research analyst, it will rear its ugly head once again. I work as a market research analyst. Although my job sounds difficult, I really just create and hand out questionnaires. In fact, market research analysts are very similar to cashiers, but instead of documenting what people purchase, I document what they say. So you notice in that first part here, our example is, although my job sounds difficult, I really just create and hand out questionnaires. That is the example. Right? Because we're giving somebody an idea of what it is that we're actually doing. It is a brief example. It's not a narrative. But just seeing a market research analyst by itself, that can bring a number of different things to the forefront of your mind. But if I say, well, I really just create and hand out questionnaires. Well, I know what a questionnaire is, so I kind of get a better idea for what a market research analyst does. Now, the second part is really where our comparison comes in. Instead of obviously documenting what people purchase, I document what they say. So it's drawing a comparison between cashiers. Now we all have knowledge of what a cashier does. We've all purchased things in a retail environment. And so we know what a cashier does and what they do. And so by drawing a comparison, you're essentially assuming that people know what a cashier is, which is relatively common knowledge, of course, especially nowadays. And then drawing that comparison to a market research analyst by saying that, well, they document what you purchase, but I essentially document or write down what people actually say, what their opinions are. So once again, just another couple examples so you can see how this looks. Obviously there are different ways that you can word them and all those types of things here too, but just trying to give you a couple of examples. That way you can see how we utilize examples and how we utilize comparisons in our writing. All right, if you have any questions, feel free and contact me and let me know. Otherwise, have a great week, and thank you for being with us.